Good generic time of the day to you. I'm Jer Stays, and this is your Daily Detroit, recorded on Wednesday, February 13th, 2019.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Whether you're listening to this the night before or the day of, happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Well, our sound editor, Cheyenne, wants to know, who's bringing the bon?
So grab a box of chocolates, dozen roses, put on that red silk robe of yours, and let's get right into the show right after this word from our sponsor.
Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Bamboo Detroit. With an inclusive community, flexible modern offices, classes, and networking events, Bamboo Detroit helps entrepreneurs and innovative companies launch, land, or expand in Detroit. Become one of more than 400 members today at bamboodetroit.com.
If you follow Daily Detroit closely, then you certainly know the name Rivian. We, after all, did a segment on the startup electric vehicle company for Detroit Public Television last month. It aired during the auto show. We also released a podcast episode all about Rivian after visiting their Plymouth headquarters. Now, Reuters reports that both Amazon and General Motors are discussing making investments in Rivian, which only had its global coming out party last November at the Los Angeles Auto Show. Reuters says any deal to acquire minority stakes would value Rivian at between $1 billion and $2 billion. A deal could be announced as early as this month.
This really could shake some things up, Sven. I mean, this benefits Rivian. This helps with the launch. It helps them get through certifications. I mean, General Motors has a huge track record, of course, of getting through that whole testing and regulatory process. It helps out with brand. It helps them figure out how they're actually going to sell the vehicles because there's stuff already in place. This is a big move for them.
Absolutely. I mean, if it happens, it would be hugely beneficial for Rivian, which, so far has been pretty cagey about who is bankrolling them. I mean, we know a couple of the investors. If you don't live in Wall Street, they're hardly household names, but this would be huge. I mean, they're getting ready to try to launch manufacturing at their the former Mitsubishi factory that they bought in Illinois. That's going to be hugely expensive. So that'll be a huge help. I think General Motors' interest in this is interesting. I mean, Rivian, I think, got the attention of a lot of people in Los Angeles last fall, specifically truck makers. Also Tesla, which, Elon Musk he's really hot to build an electric pickup truck, but appears to be far behind Rivian in doing that. But I mean, General Motors makes its bread and butter selling pickup trucks like the Chevy Silverado, the GMC Sierra. They're releasing all these heavy-duty versions of those. And, we talked about they're hiring 1,000 workers up at the Flint assembly plant to help build them. GM's also separately making this push to electric vehicles, funded in large part by sales of those pickup trucks. So they've reportedly, Mary Barra has reportedly said, she's given some thought to electric pickup trucks, but they're presumably not very far down that path. This could be a way for them to get there.
Well, that's one of the nice things about being a big company. You can kind of buy your way up in the process. One of the things I thought was really interesting is this tie to Amazon. I want to talk about this for just a second. Some of the notes around this include that it'll help ensure packages to get to destinations on time. And it's also interesting to see Amazon make like a big jump into the electric car game.
And a lot of this is speculative, granted, because we don't know a lot about this. There weren't a lot of details. The Reuters report was all anonymous sources, of course, but you could speculate that Amazon may look at this as possibly a way to build out a fleet of electric vehicles. I mean, I think that's one thing you're starting to see a lot with companies that operate vehicle fleets is that they're looking at their carbon footprint, and they're really starting to make some, big purchases of electric vehicles as a way to lower that carbon footprint and comply with emissions rules in cities around the world.
And when we were out in Plymouth, at least to me, it was pretty clear that they viewed their skateboard, what's underneath that Rivian, as a platform.
Yeah.
And if you look at how big those SUVs and trucks are, one could easily imagine you put a box on the back of that thing. You can make it a delivery vehicle because it's just a platform.
Right. Well, I mean, going back to GM, I mean, that's possible. Again, this is speculation, but it's possible that GM could, with their minority stake, license that EV platform and use it to, underpin electric pickup trucks. Who knows?
I feel very strongly that we've criminalized the act of being poor in Michigan. Right.
Because if you're poor, there is absolutely no way in which you're going to afford auto insurance. And we want you to be a responsible person to go out and find a job and raise yourself out of the poverty that you're in and you know, provide for your family and everything else. But we've put people in this absolutely impossible position where they can't afford even the minimum amount of coverage to legally drive themselves to work. And then they're stuck in a position of either breaking the law to provide for their family or not providing for their family at all. And that to me is an absolute shame, and it's something that we as legislators need to correct this issue. It's the biggest pocketbook issue facing our state.
That's Republican State Senator Tom Barrett. He represents Charlotte, up in Eaton County. He's talking about car insurance in Michigan, which is the most expensive state to insure a vehicle in the nation. Barrett was responding to Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan, who was up in Lansing today making his pitch for auto insurance reform. It's one of Michigan's most complicated issues, with lots of stakeholders that benefit financially from the system. Think trial lawyers, insurance companies, and medical providers. Not only does Michigan have the highest rates, but in the city of Detroit, basic car insurance can easily cost more than $4,000 a year. And that's for no-fault insurance, not including theft or collision. We dispelled many myths of why auto insurance costs so much on a previous episode with Steve Gursten of the firm Michigan Auto Law. We'll link to that in the show notes. Duggan and others, including lobbyists from Dan Gilbert's companies, have not been able to make much progress with the issue. That might change this legislative session, as Republicans have marked it as a priority. Governor Whitmer, in her State of the State address last night, said she's open to working on it. Duggan is working two angles. He has filed a suit challenging Michigan's no-fault insurance law as unconstitutional. He's also trying to work in the legislature to make reforms. We're currently in the hearing stage with no concrete proposals as of yet.
Now let's be honest, none of us needs a study to tell us how bad our roads are. The evidence is impossible to ignore. By one estimate, the vehicle damage from our roads costs the average motorist $562 a year in repairs. And if you're a Detroiter, it's a lot more expensive.
As we mentioned, Governor Gretchen Whitmer delivered her first State of the State address last night in Lansing. She touched on a variety of topics, but three of them stood out to us: fixing the damn roads, gay rights, and making controversial legislation immune from voter referendum. Jared and I cover and opine on a lot of policy here at Daily Detroit, and he even interviewed then candidate Whitmer last year. So we're going to talk about this one for a quick minute. So, Jared, obviously roads were the main thing, and, fix the damn roads. That was practically, Whitmer's campaign slogan last year.
Yeah, of course. It's all about the roads. There's getting to be bipartisan agreement that money needs to be spent, Sven, but mostly this is because of pressures from people's districts. And folks still seem far apart as to how much we need to spend.
Right. Everybody gets mad about hitting potholes, right?
Right. But then you got to pay to fix it. So despite what angry internet commenters tend to say, the bill coming is real and it's way past due. Although there is study after study, there's also impacts people can feel and understand. Just this morning, freeways were coming up with new potholes. And a friend of the pod, Everett Cassimy over at Channel 4, he had his sunroof smashed in while driving down I-75 by a falling chunk of the overpass recently.
Brutal. So Everett Cassimy obviously is a well-known public figure. He gets more attention, but I mean, this is the kind of thing that regular folks are experiencing all the time. I think we're going to be hearing more stories like that. I also just read this quote in a follow-up story in MLive. They spoke with the GOP Senate Majority Leader, Mike Shirkey. Here's what he had to say, quote, "There's no way we're going to fix this problem that's been 50 years in the making without coming up with new revenue for infrastructure," end quote. So he and the House Majority Leader, or House Speaker Lee Chatfield, are signaling that they're open to new revenues, which is very significant. I'm not ready to say that that's going to be neat and tidy, and that doesn't mean there's not going to be fights coming up. I'm not that gullible. But Jared, you also kind of shook things up last week. You published an op-ed about asking whether it's time to bring toll roads to Michigan.
Well, and to be clear, as I said in the piece, I'm not really sure, Sven, that toll roads are the answer, but it was more to push the window of conversation. I think everything should be on the table. One idea I recently heard floated was to do something with registration fees. So if you do some back of the napkin math, there are about 11 million cars on Michigan's roads. And if you want to come up with $1.5 billion a year, yeah, you'd be looking at about $136 extra in fees every year.
And we should point out that $1.5 billion, you didn't just pull that out of the air. That's what Paul Ajegba, the new MDOT director, said was needed on top of current revenues. But that's just for the state's portion, the roads that MDOT oversees,
right?
Not local cities, villages, and counties.
And we talked about that in a previous episode of the pod. Although, if I could pull $1.5 billion out of the air for us, I definitely would. But the real question is are we willing to pay that? The reality here is Michigan is that unless your job is in the city of Detroit, or for some reason you happen to be able to be walkable to your job within like a mile, the reality is you've got to drive in this state. You got to drive everywhere. Driving is the way everything works. And so is adding that on part of the solution? Do you do a little bit of that and a little bit of this to get to the number we need? But what I like about this is it kind of shows the per person number kind of clearly on what we actually need to spend here.
All right, let's move on. Equal rights was another discussion point. The governor talked about the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act.
Yes, and that's a controversial one for some. Right now, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, in the state of Michigan, it's totally legal to fire someone because they're gay. The Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act right now does not expressly protect LGBTQ people from discrimination around employment, around housing, education, and access to like public accommodations. A lot of folks on the right and conservatives thinks this is a distraction. However, I know from a lot of personal experience, whether it's hiring, dealing with employment, that this is an issue for some talent coming to the state that we don't have these protections.
Yeah, right. And a number of big companies in Detroit launched a push just a few years ago to add these protections for LGBTQ people to the Elliott-Larsen Act.
Yeah, and the reality is there's a good number of high-tech and skilled folks who just aren't considering Michigan because of its policies around this. Personally, for my personal opinion, I think it's a no-brainer we protect all Michiganders.
So you go with Michigander, not Michiganian.
You know, I know there is an active debate online around this, but to me, it'll always be Gander.
All right. Finally, let's talk about referendums, which Governor Whitmer spoke about. That's how Michigan legalized marijuana last year through the referendum process, meaning residents go to the polls and vote on ballot proposals.
Yeah, Governor Whitmer was pretty strong here. She specifically said she'd stop bills that were referendum-proof, as she called it. In Michigan, you can attach an amount of money to a bill to make it a spending bill, but then the public can't vote about it. It just is law, and there's nothing that the public can do.
Right. And Republican lawmakers did a lot of this during the Governor Rick Snyder's era. Think about the emergency manager law. In 2012, there was a ballot proposal approved by voters statewide to do away with the emergency manager law. Republicans turned around, passed a virtually identical bill and slapped a spending measure on it, and it made it referendum-proof. They did similar things with right to work and also repealing prevailing wage requirements. So it's been a controversial legislative tool for sure.
And looking at the crowds, it was probably the most divisive of the responses among the legislature, exactly for that reason. It's one of those tools in the toolbox they've gone back to. I don't know if from a politicking perspective, I mean, it's a pretty smart way to work the rules in your favor, even if it maybe isn't in the spirit of the law.
But it's also a way to subvert the will of the people pretty well, too.
Completely it is. Completely. But I mean, that's what governments do on a regular basis, right? Like use process to subvert things. You know, privately, I've heard many times that there are a good number of legislators in general who they just hate the referendum process. And from my point of view, covering it, of course they do. The referendum process, it kind of is a check on their power, right? And there are practical arguments to be made that some make in the weeds that this is representative and not a direct democracy, but those don't really stand up so well in these individual cases, at least in my opinion. And this is just me, and maybe I'm biased because we're part of the media and we like to check these things. But when it comes to government, I've learned the powerful usually do what keeps them in power unless you push them.
Detroit City FC continues to dribble out bits of its schedule for the upcoming 2019 campaign. Today, the club said it'll host the Michigan State University men's soccer team in a preseason friendly Saturday, April 20th. Instead of holding the game at Keyworth Stadium in Hamtramck, though, the match will take place at the Corner Ballpark. That's the park for the Detroit Police Athletic League, over on the former site of Tiger Stadium. That's largely because Keyworth is due to have its artificial turf surface replaced in April, thanks to a grant from the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation. A City FC spokeswoman adds that the club's ties with Detroit PAL make it a good fit as a venue. The Spartans are coming off a season in which they made it all the way to the semifinals of the NCAA College Cup for the first time since 1968. Their tally of 14 wins for the season tied a record for single-season wins. City's former head coach, Ben Pierman, was also a top assistant with the Spartans men's soccer team. This is the second friendly City has announced so far for the 2019 season. The first is an exhibition match at Chattanooga FC on April 6th. City will play host to 16 home matches this year, including the NPSL regular season and the inaugural NPSL Founders Cup, which starts August 10th, when the Rouge travel to South Florida to take on Miami FC. Detroit City is part of that competition's East region, along with Chattanooga FC, Miami United FC, Milwaukee Torrent, and the New York Cosmos. The club announced the hiring of new head coach Trevor James in January.
Today's episode is brought to you in part by Milo Digital. Milo Digital is a full-service digital marketing agency that engineers quality results through data and innovative strategies. Learn more over at milodetroit.com.
At least 2 Detroit area businesses are being ordered to stop selling beverages with CBD oil. Chick-P, located on Clifford Street near Washington Boulevard, began offering cannabidiol as an optional addition to its smoothies for $5 just earlier this week. The eatery tells WXYZ that the Detroit Health Department the following day told them to stop offering it because it's not approved as a food additive by federal or state agencies. The station says the Ale Mary craft beer bar and restaurant in Royal Oak was also ordered to remove CBD from its cocktails by officials in Oakland County. Both restaurants said they believed that it was legal to use CBD oil. That's a non-psychoactive substance which is derived from hemp. After the passage of a federal farm bill in 2018 legalized hemp cultivation and declassified it as a Schedule I controlled substance. It follows similar crackdowns on CBD-infused menu items in Los Angeles and New York City.
Sven, I'm really glad on these stories that you read cannabidiol. you tend to be, you're becoming a pro at reading cannabidiol.
Cannabidiol. Okay, friends, with that, I'm Sven Gustafson. Thanks so much for listening. Remember, you can be part of our show by becoming a Patreon member. Join us at patreon.com/dailydetroit. And thanks.
And I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.